I'd like to introduce Julianne Manchin. She is a librarian, she is a genealogist, she's a researcher, historian, writer. She has her own website, she does it all. And she is here this evening to talk about her book. I want to make sure I get the name correct. Secrets of the Asylum, Norwich State Hospital, and My Family. So she's going to give a talk about that. And I just want to let everybody know that she does have copies of her book available for sale and signing after the program. She's going to give her talk, and then there'll be time for Q&A. We just ask that everyone please keep their questions brief. I know this is a subject that people are very passionate about and have a lot of questions, but we want to try to get to everybody's questions this evening. So, but within a time frame. So if we can make that work, that would be great. So I'm going to hand it over to Julianne, and thank you for coming here tonight, Julianne. You're welcome.
So hi, years ago I came here to do some research, and I said I was going to write a book about my family at Norwich State Hospital, and they said, if you write a book and you come and appear at our library, I guarantee you will pack the room. So mission accomplished. So thank you very much for coming. I wanted to get a sense of how many people here used to work at the hospital? Quite a few. Now, are there any people in the audience who have family members who are patients there? Okay, and of you all, were any of you able to get patient records to look at? Okay. Two, right?
Well, we're sisters.
Oh, so that counts as one, right?
I was only able to get CBH, but not Norwich Hospital. I guess they said they were destroyed.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it's good because I wanted to get the sense of, what people I have in the room. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour about what's important to me, and then we'll do Q&A. I'm sure there are some things that that's important to you, and also, I'm expecting to learn something because obviously folks who work there have their own perspective on the hospital. So I'm here to talk about Norwich State Hospital and its impact in my family, and there were 4 women in my ancestry who were patients there, and one of them went on to be an employee. So my book, Secrets of the Asylum, is written about what happened to 2 generations of my family and how the repercussions of those events trickled down to my generation. And I didn't really set out to write a history of Norwich State Hospital, but what I've done is show how the history of my family and the history of the hospital intersected. And it's about how an institution like Norwich State Hospital has an effect on families, not just the patients. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's also about how having access to the patient records and using that to create a more complete and correct family history can be empowering and also can heal old wounds in the family. I found a ton of secrets, and it really did reshape my understanding of my own family. So one of the things I was very interested in was in 2019 there was a raised bill in the Connecticut Assembly, and it's called an Act Concerning the Preservation of Historical Records and Access to Restricted Records in the State Archives. And it would have allowed access to restricted records after 50 years, and that would include things like the patient records at Norwich State Hospital. But unfortunately, it didn't pass. And but the thing that I want to point out is that the state librarian at the time testified in favor of this act, and he gave some reasons why people would want to see these records, and I found it resonated very much with my reasons for wanting them. It says, reconstruction of family history through greater knowledge about little known or forgotten relatives who spent time in state hospitals, sanatoriums, reformatories, and prisons. Discovering information about these persons is important in the formation and maturing of personal identity in a healthy, positive environment. And he also mentioned the need, obviously, people need a more complete medical history. And then the other thing is that citizens of the state have right to know how their tax dollars are used to treat these vulnerable people. So that's enough about that, but I just really like that quote. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about my mother, because this is how it kind of started for me, was my mother. So she was born in 1925, and she grew up in Connecticut, first in Stonington, and then in Danielson, and then later in Norwich. And she graduated from Norwich Free Academy in 1943, and I'm wearing her class ring right now. And she went on to the University of Connecticut in 1947, and then she moved to Washington, D.C. just a couple years after World War II ended. And my father also moved to Washington, D.C. about the same time from Indiana. So they met at Catholic University of America. They married in 1948, and I'm the third of their 6 children. So my mother had dabbled in genealogy for years, even decades. But I wasn't interested, because it just seemed to me like it was like gathering dry facts, like, who begat whom, and where they married, and when they died, and all that. But Mom had these stories that she told, and that's what I was interested in. I had questions about her stories, and she started telling them to me when I was about 11. And I'm going to show you 2 of the stories, and you will probably scratch your head like I did. So, my mother's stories. So the first one is, when my mother was a child, she lived in a shed. Her father deserted her mother and went back to Canada, causing her mother to go insane. Some doctors thought it was a good idea to pull out all of her mother's teeth. Okay. And then this story is the one that she told the most. My mother had an uncle who set her up in business running a delicatessen in Stonington. During the Great Depression, the business failed. When I was 7 years old, my mother became mentally ill and was sent to a mental hospital. I was taken from my father and put into the county home. Now, my mom really didn't like it if I asked her a lot of questions, and she really didn't like it if I suggested that her father wasn't a good father, because, I never understood her insistence he was such a good father, because he divorced her mother while she was in the state hospital, and he never got my mother out of the county home. But I also remember asking my mom, why would a doctor pull out somebody's teeth? That just didn't make any sense to me. So, and with that, on that one, she just said, well, that's what I was told. And then over the years, as I was thinking, I said, I know where she got her family history. She got it from her mother, who was a paranoid schizophrenic, and maybe not the most reliable source. So, for a while, I just left it at that. Now, the thing that bothered me about genealogy was, and she was really very into it, but it didn't matter how much research she did, those stories never changed. And so, and that's what I wanted. I wanted a complete, narrative of family history, and I was like, well, apparently genealogy doesn't do that. In 2012, she was about 87 years old, and she had to go into assisted living, and it was just a much smaller room. So I inherited all of her genealogy files. And first, all I did was I was going to just take all these boxes, put them in the basement, hang on to them until somebody else in the family decided that they wanted to do genealogy. But then the librarian in me couldn't resist, going through, and maybe I could organize it so it doesn't take up so much space and all that. And then in the process, it was like I didn't realize I was on a slippery slope from being a reluctant genealogist to a relentless family historian. So I'm looking around in the files, and I was kind of surprised about what I didn't find in there. One of it was, very much about my grandmother's time at Norwich State Hospital. But I did find a couple of letters, and they were letters that were sent to my grandmother while she was a patient there. And on the envelope, it said Norwich State Hospital. And so you have to understand that up to that point, I wasn't really sure what the name of the hospital was, the quote, mental hospital was. So now I had a name. And of course, now we're in the age of Google. So I Googled, Norwich State Hospital patient records. It's like, boom, came right up. The state library has the state archives. I'm sorry, I keep going back and forth. The state archives at the state library have Norwich State Hospital patient records. Not all of them, but because they took up a lot of room. But fortunately for me, my family records were there. And what happened was I contacted the archivist and I gave him my grandmother's name and he said, I'll get back to you. And he writes back to me a couple of days later and he says, yes, I found your grandmother's records, but we keep track of the relationships between the patients. He says, you know, there's 3 other family members in there. And I'm like, really? So these are the family members that were there. My great-grandmother Graziella, who was there from 1908 to 1910. Her sister Rose from 1924 to 1925. My grandmother Beatrice, 1935 to 1944. And then she has sister Pauline, after whom my mother was named. She was there from 1929 to 1930. And then in addition, Beatrice had another sister named Dora, and she was patient for the last 20 years of her life at Kings Park State Hospital in New York State. So that's a lot of mental illness in one family. It kind of bowled me over. So what I want to do here is just review the names I'll be talking about so you have some perspective. So Pauline, when I talk about Pauline, it's my mother. Beatrice and Frank are my grandparents. Graziella and Felipe are my great-grandparents. And Pierre and Isilda are my great-great-grandparents. So another thing is, let me show you what's in the patient records. So I made this list very quickly, and it's not exhaustive, I'll admit it, but you know, every patient's file's got different things. But these are the kinds of things that you would find in a patient record, and some of them are really helpful in constructing the family history. And one of them is the history of the mental illness, and that's a history they take of the patient's behaviors leading up to the point that determined that they were mentally ill and needed to be committed. And then there was a social history, and that was based partly on what the patient said about their family, but they did go out and confirm it with family members. And it was really great for me because they had like names and relationships. And I'll just say as an aside, it was especially important for me because of all of the problems in my family, there was alienation between that part of the family and my family. So, you know, it informed me, like you'd think I would know my cousins, but there's one cousin and I only known her for what, 10 years when I started this project because of the kind of alienation that happens sometimes with mental illness. And then the other one, which is really interesting, I only had this interval history, and I only had that for my grandmother. But the reason is because that is a report that they make if someone is in the hospital and then they get paroled, and then it's determined that they need to go back to the hospital. That's the interval between when the 2 times they were admitted, and it's all about what happened and why it is that that person is going back. And in my grandmother's case, it was, you know, the social worker would go out and visit her and see how she was doing, and apparently not well. And also, in her case, the town selectmen were consulted, and also the state police. But anyway, all of this, I hope I'll show in a little while, was useful in building the family history that I wanted. Now, what I didn't find in the patient records, to my surprise, was not much about how they treated mental illness. You know, there was a lot of like incident reports and, you know, progress reports, but nothing like, you know, today I took her to the hypnotherapy room or anything like that. So what I had to do was, that's why this book has so much history in it, because I needed to inform myself and really just be satisfied with it. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but these are the kind of things I believe probably happened. So one of them is I read the biennial reports of the Norwich State Hospital, and lucky for me, I mean, some of them were at the state library, and they would send me photocopies, but many of them were actually at Library of Congress where I used to work, so I could get them there. So I did read pretty much from the beginning to about 1945. Whew. And the other thing I found was there was a 1939 investigation into the hospital, and there was a copy of that in the state archive, so I got that. And there was also a rebuttal to that report by the ward of the hospital. And that was very helpful in the sense that 1939 was the year my grandmother was there, so I was like, okay, I'm getting an idea of what's going on here. And then the other thing I did was read a lot about mental health care, and basically the first half of the 20th century was what I focused on, because that's, really where my ancestors were. So let me just go on to talk about my great-grandmother Graziella's generation. So her parents, Pierre and Isilda, were French Canadians, and they left Quebec in the late 19th century. And then their daughter Graziella, she married Philippe in 1899, and they all were settled in Danielson, Connecticut. And so Philippe and Graziella had their first child in 1901, and that was my grandmother. And by 1907, they had 4 children in all, and they were poor mill workers, and I pretty much determined it was a Quinnebog mill where they worked. And they were poor mill workers, and somehow they ended up living in a shed, which, when I first heard that, I was like, Grandma must have been exaggerating. But, so one of the things that Graziella's patient record helped me with was figuring out where the shed was. And that's Isilda in the middle of the left-hand picture, and that's my grandmother on the left, and then her sister Denora on the right, and then these two, Corinne Bonneau and Elodia Bonneau, were my grandmother's aunts, and this is my grandmother right here, and those are her siblings. So anyway, I found a letter. There was also a correspondence file that went with each of the patient records, and I found this letter from one of Graziella's sisters, explaining that the children were in the care of Isilda. So I thought, well, the shed's probably where Isilda and Pierre lived. So in the book I go into more detail about this, but suffice it to say, I figured out where the shed had been and who was living with them and if they had a shed. It was kind of interesting. So this is what I found out. And that's the picture that's actually on the cover of the book. So it turned out there were 8 people living in this small house. So if Pierre if Philippe and Graziella came to that house and said, we need a place to stay, the shed was really all there was. So then I located where it would be, and I found that the building, the house and the shed were still standing. And another amazing thing was that it was on the market at the time. And so I talked to a real estate agent, and I explained I wasn't going to buy the house, but she said, yeah, no problem. It turns out she also worked or was on the board of some local historical society, so she's like, oh yeah, you want to see your ancestral home? I get it. So she let me in, and so I walked all through the house, and I actually got to stand in the shed, which to me was one of those things I felt I needed to do to honor my grandmother's experience by actually standing in this little shed. So while she was living in the shed, Graziella began to display, some dysfunctional behavior, I guess is the way you put it. But in 1908, there was a fire. I don't know whether it was in the shed or the house, but it really scared her. And then she had a miscarriage, and then she just really started becoming more ill, and she started raving, or she'd go silent, or she just did all kinds of, strange behavior. But also she said she wanted to kill herself, and she also wanted to kill Philippe. So Philippe went to the town selectmen, because that's how it was done in the day. The towns would determine who was going to go, who needed to go to state hospitals, because the town would pay their way. So anyway, he did that, and so, and 2 doctors examined her, determined she was indeed insane, so she was sent, the court orders to leave, but they said, without delay, to Norwich State Hospital. So Norwich State Hospital for the Insane, as it was then known, had been open for 4 years. And the administration building had just been completed. And there were 4 patient buildings. And the patient population around the time that Graziella was admitted was 434 patients, which doesn't sound like a lot, except for the buildings were only designed to hold 400. So one of the things I noticed by reading all of these reports is the hospital was always, no matter how many buildings they added, it was always said to be overcrowded. Now, when she was first admitted, Graziella, so she was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, and she was sent to a building called North B, which later was renamed the Belleville. And in the weeks that followed, she was depressed and she wanted to kill herself. And but then after a few weeks, she kind of came out of it. And so these are the kind of things that I found in her. Okay, I guess I did that as an animation. I wonder if I can do this up here. So this one from August 23, 1908, basically says she's more cheerful. And this one here is much brighter. And then this one here, much more cheerful, improving. But then more than a month passes, and there's this note. And I'll read it because I know you all can see it. It says, October 18, 1908. About 3 weeks ago, the patient became disturbed. She threw her teeth down the toilet, and they have not been found. And the word teeth popped out because, didn't Mom say some doctor thought it was a good idea to pull out all her teeth? So what I did was I used the admission record because they would say what the person looked like when they walked in the door. And you can see it says teeth, fair. So she had her teeth when she was admitted to the hospital. So I take from that between September 11, when she was said to be improving, and then I think it was September 27 was the day I calculated that was when she threw her dentures away. Somewhere in that gap, some doctor did indeed pull out all her teeth. And then I wondered why. So that was where some of my research in the history of mental health care came in, was that I found that there was a theory going around that time that they believed that mental illness was caused by hidden infections in the body, and that the most likely place for those infections would be in the teeth. So there was a lot of teeth pulled at state hospitals in the day, and I go into more detail about that in the book. But suffice it to say, this brought it all together, and it was like, so anyway, she never got better, and eventually she was transferred to a building for a ward called North D, and it was later renamed Dick's. Because that was a ward for disturbed patients. And so she just didn't get any better, and then in December 1910, she died at the hospital. So having my great-grandmother's patient record helped me confirm the story about the shed and about the teeth. But the part about Philippe running away, causing her to go insane, turns out was not true, because in the record, they also had a visitor log, and he was visiting her. And in the correspondence file, I saw letters from him checking with the superintendent, do you think she could come home, and whatever. And according to the visitor card that I had, he actually visited the day before she died, and he brought the local priest with him. So he was with her throughout her illness. But I did find that later on, he did abandon the family. And so why he did, and he didn't go back to Canada either. And where he went, who he went with, is like a story that I go into in the book. So, we got next. Oh, so now we go to Grandma. Oh, I forgot to show you. This is a letter, one of the letters from Philippe. How long will she have to stay there yet? I'd like to have an idea. Anyway, so I used my grandmother's patient record to confirm Mom's story about the delicatessen of the mental hospital and the county home. So in the early 1920s, my grandmother Beatrice met my grandfather Frank, and they were like opposites. So she was petite, dark-haired, French-Canadian, and Catholic, and he was tall, fair-haired, Anglo-American, and Protestant. So their two families objected to the courtship based on religion alone. But in addition, Beatrice's family felt that since they had been taken care of for all her life, that she owed it to them to stay and continue to make money to support the family. And then I think an additional reason for Frank's family to address was because she was really difficult, and I think that they were concerned. But despite the family disapproval, they married in 1922. Now, they'd only been married for 2 months when Beatrice left Frank and went to live in Stonington with her Aunt Blanche and her husband, Napoleon Goyette. And Beatrice lived with them in an apartment above the delicatessen that Blanche and Napoleon ran. And so that's the building, and if you ever go to Stonington, that's the Water Street Cafe now. That is, so she was there for 3 years, and then she became pregnant, and she and Frank got back together again. And the family more was that they continued to see each other during the separation. So Napoleon set Beatrice up to run the deli in Stonington, and then he moved his family to Mystic, and they started a grocery store. So, so my mother was born in 1925, and she spent her early years in Stonington at the deli. And then Beatrice's psychotic symptoms started to emerge, and so there's some stuff in her record about, her patient record says, in 1928 and 1929, she went into some sort of a trance. She was passive and had spasms of laughter and crying, accused her husband of illicit relations with his stepmother, used bad language, screamed, and was assaultive toward her mother-in-law. So, and when I read that, I always remember, my mom was a little child in the house with this going on, so kind of made her go after what she was going through. And then in 1931, during the worst of the Depression, the deli failed, and so Frank and Beatrice and Pauline had to move out, and they moved back to Danielson. And then Beatrice became depressed about having lost the deli, so she was being more disturbed. And then my grandfather, Frank, for his part, he was a World War I veteran, and he had been mustard gas. He got mustard gas, and also he had post-traumatic stress disorder. So, it was called shell shock back then. And he claimed, in some of the reports I read from the social workers, he claimed the only way he could control her behavior was to beat her up. So again, my mom, a young girl, is probably witnessing a good deal of this. So one night on July 1935, so Frank and Beatrice got in a particularly terrible fight, and after it was over, the town called the state police to have them check on the family. And so they came by, and then the state police decided we need to get, they referred the Connecticut Humane Society, which had a children's division, and they were going there to check on my mother's welfare. And the result of that visit was that Beatrice was taken to Norwich State Hospital. And in her interviews with the staff, whoever it was that talked to her as she came in, she revealed the real reason why the delicatessen failed. And it was really a scandalous story that I would not have known without getting the patient record. No spoilers here, you got my book. But anyway, so my mother was sent to the New London County Temporary Home, and she wasn't allowed to stay with her father. Probably, I believe now, it was because, he had a history of domestic violence, and they were concerned about her welfare. But I don't think I ever heard any evidence that he actually was violent towards my mother, but still, the other reason why she needed to be taken away was clearly he also needed to get his own medical issues taken care of, so this was the solution. So the county home was a place where neglected and uncared for children were placed, and it was called a temporary home because the idea was it was a holding place for children over the age of 6 who, might be placed in a foster home eventually, or they could be returned to their family if the conditions in the home improved. But the reality was, during the Great Depression and also during World War II, the state agencies were overwhelmed trying to place children who were too young to be admitted there. So the fact is, my mother lived there from 1935 to 1941, so from the age of 10 to the age of 16. And there were about 80 children in the county home, and they had their own school that went up to the 8th grade. And it was less than a mile from Norwich State Hospital, so actually Beatrice was able to visit her daughter and vice versa. And for a while, my grandfather also visited my mother, but after a few years, he stopped coming. So this is what it looks like now. You've probably seen it. So in 1941, the state decided to close down the county home, and so my mother was finally moved out of there, and she was placed in a foster home. And I should mention also, my mom was a particular problem. She had severe lung ailment, and a lot of foster parents didn't want to take a child that had medical problems. But she was a very good girl, and she was very studious, and I think so they found a good home for her. And actually, I think while she was living in foster care and still going to Norwich Free Academy, she went through the public library in Norwich. So that's how, I guess, the family trade of being a librarian got started. So, and the other thing is, in sometime, like in the mid-40s, they sold this building to Norwich State Hospital bought it. And it was then named the Bryan Building after one of the superintendents, who, to me, I'll talk about in a little bit, was one of the heroes in this situation. So my mother graduated from the county home in 1939, and because it was within town limits of Norwich, as you know, some of your residents, you get to go to Norwich State Hospital. And for her, that was great because back in Danielson, her parents probably could not have afforded to send her to such a good school. And the other thing is that Grandma was skeptical about my mom's interest in furthering her education. And she used to say, all that book learning is going to crack your head. But my mother persisted, and she got a lot of encouragement and help from Norwich Free Academy, and also there was a state social worker assigned to her case, and she got scholarships and grants and awards that enabled her to go to University of Connecticut. So I think that was a big step in helping her pull herself out of the situation she was in. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Grandma was diagnosed with dementia precox, which is now known as paranoid schizophrenia. And she was assigned to North G, which was later renamed the Mitchell Building. And she was said to be well-behaved, and she was very helpful on the ward. And although she missed her husband and child, this is one of the things I want to stress about when people say negative things about the hospital. For my grandmother, I feel like it was a true asylum. It took her out of a situation where she's getting abused and protected her from that, and she very clearly was ill. So, I think of that in positive terms. So, and here's Dr. William A. Bryan, and he was appointed as a superintendent in 1940 after the 1939 investigation into the hospital. There was a bit of upheaval in the administration, but he made many changes in how the hospital was run, and I feel like some of the changes he made actually were to my grandmother's benefit. And so one of the things, he ordered all the patients to be reevaluated. And then he instituted some policies that gave patients more freedom and privileges. Another thing that happened is World War II. So it had always been difficult to get enough male attendants at Norwich State Hospital because men could find better paying jobs in the trades like carpentry or like being an electrician or an auto mechanic. So they were always competing with that. And then the war broke out, and then the pool was even smaller because obviously men joined the military or they got jobs in the defense industry. So Dr. Bryan had a very unique solution, which was he recruited attendants from the patient populations. And when my grandmother was, like I said, she was paranoid schizophrenic, but she was actually pretty high functioning. And so she was one of the first people. So this is what he said, though, in one of the reports. The use of patient attendants is something that 2 years ago would have seemed impracticable and almost too absurd to think about, to say nothing about put into active practice. About 10 months ago, when we began to feel the acute shortage of attendant personnel, it was decided to try using some of our patients as attendants. And according to her record, she was one of the first patients to be given that opportunity. And this was the first step towards her independence and eventual discharge from the hospital. So this is my grandmother around 1946. So in 1943, she was doing well enough to be paroled, but she didn't really have anywhere to go, and they needed her, and she seemed to be working well. So they paroled her, basically, I don't know if they would say they paroled her to the hospital or paroled her herself, but anyway, basically, they moved her into employee housing, and she had, I think, a total of 3 paroles, and then at the end, in 1944, she was discharged from the hospital, and she became a regular state employee. And in the meantime, Frank had divorced her, and while she was a patient in 1945, well, no, actually, it was after she was discharged, but like 1945, and he married somebody else. So Grandma continued to live in employee housing and actually was there for 14 years after her discharge. And the interesting thing was that when she retired, she and Frank got back together. I know, I was like, when I first learned it as a child, I'm like, and they remarried in 1958. And I asked my mother once, I said, why did Grandma and Grandpa get together again? And she said, I think my father liked the way she made his life exciting. And I'm like, there's a story in the book about her chasing him down the street with a baseball bat. I just thought, that's not the kind of excitement that I was. So, let's see, where are we? There's Mr. Frank and me. So learning about her history at Norwich State Hospital, I began to admire my grandmother's ability to, make the best of the circumstances she was in despite her mental illness. But unfortunately, I didn't have a very good relationship with her because her visits to our house were stressful. And one of the things she would do is she would follow my mother around and basically pick everything she did. And then every visit usually included, one blow up. And one time, Mom ran out of instant coffee. Boom, so it was tough. And then other times, I remember one time she came and she was like in a trance and she didn't even notice we were there. It was just like really like, what's wrong with Grandma? So I just kept my distance from her. And then she died when I was 10. So really, I just wasn't able to have a relationship with her. But now, when she died, Grandpa came and moved in with us in Maryland. And my mother was really delighted. And so it was very tragic for her that he died 4 months later, that same year. Anyway, I admired the way Mom pursued her education, and she saw it as a way out of the poverty and dysfunction that she had grown up in. And she was grateful for the state's role in her life. And one of the things she said to me, I always felt the state of Connecticut was very caring. They gave me a degree probably so that I wouldn't be a burden to the state, and they tried to rehabilitate my mother. So I feel fortunate that I was able to access Beatrice and Graziosa's records because they answered so many questions that Mom either couldn't or wouldn't answer. And I now know how traumatized she had been throughout her childhood. She witnessed domestic violence, she was separated from her family, and she probably lived with feelings of loneliness and abandonment and shame. And as tragic as the story is, I was really glad to learn the truth because the family story finally made sense. And, you know, my mom was not really a warm person. She wasn't very good at empathy. But she was a good mother in other ways. But, you know, the lack of emotional sensitivity was sometimes a problem. But I think at some point in my adulthood, I thought, well, you know, where did she learn how to be a parent? She had a schizophrenic mother, she had an absentee father, and then the county home, even though she thought it was good for her, but she was competing with 80 other children, you know, so I feel like she was the best mother she could have been under the circumstances. So that's what I hope is part of the healing part of knowing family history, is having more empathy for people that you had a problem with in the past. So anyway, that is all I have to say. And what did I do?
Just enlarge it.
Enlarge. And how do I unenlarge it? I've done this before, and I can't remember how I got myself out of it. There's one more screen, darn it. Is there anybody who's a
Bottom
PowerPoint?
corner. Bottom corner. You should be able to shake it.
I do not know what's going on here. Kathy, how?
What are we trying to do?
The last slide won't come up because this one has become giant. You know what?
You can go ahead and start with the questions.
Yeah, if you could like close the PowerPoint and just go back to the very last slide. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. And I really want to get this straight because it's got. Yeah, now do the next one.
Our picture right there.
No, left.
Yeah, go.
Okay. Yay! There we go. So this is a lot of information. The other thing is I am selling books for $20 cash or PayPal. I really hope you got cash because I'm having trouble figuring out PayPal. So anyway, if there's, is there anybody here who wanted to pay that way? Yeah. Because I've had enough technology glitches today, so that saves me from one more. Okay, so, and if you want to buy it online, you know, it's a print-on-demand publisher. So what happened was the book was released, all the pre-orders was filled, and they immediately went out of stock. And they said it takes 2 to 3 weeks to restock at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. But if you go to store.bookbaby.com and search for the book, they're shipping it out, I think, right away. So anyway, that's an FYI. So who's got the first question? Okay, you?
Yeah, I don't have a question. I have a comment. My name's Peter Liber, and I was president of the auxiliary.
Auxiliary of what?
Of Norwich Hospital.
Oh, they have an
They had an auxiliary.
And it was a staff
It was
organization?
an amazing place.
But what was that, a staff organization?
I'll explain.
Oh.
Basically, it was a group of people that met to deal with patients Valentine's Day, Christmas, and so on. And I'm not sure if I remember how many people were on the board, but it was one of the most gratifying things I've ever done. We provided at Christmas time, through the graciousness of the owner of the Prime Steer, who had somebody living in Norwich Hospital. And he would always put on a Christmas dinner. And we would organize that. We had 2 buses that would come down from Norwich Hospital, unload patients, and a full dinner with music that I played along with Dick Carrick. I don't know whether any of you know, good accordion player, and I played button accordion. So we played carols, and then we socialized afterwards. And one of the craziest things that went on is we danced with these patients. And it was amazing. And I always remember a patient called Mary. She would come when we were doing Christmas decorations in the California, whatever it was. She would come flying down the corridor, wham, wrap her arms around you.
Oh, that's nice.
And she ended up dancing also. There was one other patient. The folks in Norwich Hospital, my interaction with them was, they were at all levels. And Yvonne happened to be the head nurse. And I went into this one room in Kettlebell, and it was filled with smoke, it was blue smoke, because everybody smoked in those days. And I went in, there's a young man named, I'll call him Bob. I said, "Oh, Bob, how are you doing?" I said, "Well, are you going home for Thanksgiving?" "No." I said, "Okay. Well, nice talking." And I went out and I asked Yvonne, I said, "This guy Bob that I talked to seemed like a really interesting guy." "Yeah, he's really interesting." And I said, "He's not going home for Thanksgiving. Why can't he get out for Thanksgiving?" "One reason." I said, "What's that?" "He killed his mother, father, and sister."
Oh, that's sad.
So you met all sorts of individuals there that you could empathize with.
Mhm.
And those were,
Well, that's
blessed
interesting.
days. Let me put it that way. Dealing with
Okay,
these folks. And what an amazing hospital that was. It hard to get salt set when people have such bad things to say.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think that over the years, it was many things to different people. One of the things that I went into in the book, because my grandmother had eventually become an attendant, I did some research on what did attendants do. What was their jobs like, especially like, in the 20s, 30s, even back as far as the beginning of the hospital. And so, like, I have heard people allude to the fact that, there were various abuses at the hospital, but it's really hard to find like hard evidence of a particular incident. But I did look at how things were structured, and I thought the way they were overworked, the conditions they worked under, the demands that were on them, left the situation open for somebody to be abused. If the wrong person got a job as an attendant, they could be like, somebody who thought that they were judge and jury and mistreat people because, of their own problems. But what I'm saying is, I know bad things happened to there. I felt that having a great-grandmother's teeth all pulled out was a bad thing. But I do think that just the way the hospital was staffed left the situation open for abuse to happen if the wrong person was in one of these jobs. So that's just my thought on it. But that's why I did it, even though I wanted to know about my family, it's like to fill in the blanks, I did a lot of just general research on mental health care just to get more of an idea of what happened to them. So any other questions? Sure.
So are there any records left from, any inpatient records left from the 1950s or 60s?
I haven't checked it in a while, but I saw when I looked at what was on the State Archives website, it looked like there was a big gap between 46 and 61, unfortunately. I think they left things behind because they just couldn't put it all into the archive space, but that's unfortunate because I'm sure the stuff got vandalized or whatever and disappeared. So, yeah, because I don't work for the state archives and I don't know what work they're doing, I would never say, give up if they were there in the 50s. I would recommend people ask. I could be wrong, or maybe in the meantime they found some other source or whatever, but it doesn't look good for people who were there in the 1950s. That's all I can really say.
I just communicated with the Connecticut State Library, and I was told that the records have been destroyed.
The ones that in that gap year?
Yeah, I had a great aunt hospitalized in 1925, and she died in 1944. And I can't access them. She was at CVH though initially, and then transferred to Norwich Hospital. And I got to see some of the CVH records, but most of the records have been destroyed.
Yeah, my understanding was that they said something like they had all the records for people who were discharged from the hospital up to like the end of 1944. And my grandmother was discharged like 2 months before that end, so I was like really lucky that, you know, that the record was still there. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not all of them. If we could go back in time and rescue those.
I was able to receive one sheet, because I had a great uncle there also,
Mhm.
who was at Norwich State, and I have one sheet, but it shows he had probably bipolar disorder, and so I was able to obtain that, but, and I was grateful for what we received.
Yeah.
It was very informative, but
Well,
I think a lot of the records are gone.
yeah, so now I'm feeling even more lucky, because I'll tell you, when I said to the art director, I said, okay, yeah, copy it all, I'll take it, I'll pay for it, it cost me $70. I got about 200 pages of stuff, half of which referred to my grandmother, which was, of course, the thing I was most interested in was her life, but then seeing how what happened earlier flowed into what happened to her own life, you know, I was interested in it all, really.
Since you are a librarian, you know, should we stop with this most recent rejection, if you will, that the records are gone? I always tend to think maybe there's a way to find them somehow, or I know that there used to be a Rocky Hill. I
First of all, I'm a
remember
retired librarian.
Yeah.
But in the case of, when we're talking about something that's one of a kind, you know, and they're the only people that have it, if they say they don't have it, and I believe if they don't have it, they really don't have it, because when they do have the records, they are very forthcoming.
Yeah,
So,
they were very
No,
nice.
they were very nice. It's just I wonder when they were destroyed.
Probably about the time you'd have to look, that webpage I showed you should have something about when they acquired it. But you know, I think, you know, the hospital was closed, and I think things were left behind, and eventually someone said, oh, maybe we should go over and get stuff. And they probably started taking it out, the oldest first, and then they were like, oh my gosh, we have no room. And so I don't know, and it probably just happened then, and then they had to turn their back on it, and then who knows what happened. I think some people in here are aware of the fact that, you know, the hospital was left unlocked basically after it was closed, and things were removed and destroyed, and including records, and it's just really sad, but, you know, it is what it is. Anyway, any other questions? Oh.
Was there any mention of the farm that they used to have?
The
And
farm?
They ran a farm there.
Oh,
The
yeah.
patients worked there, and also a laundry.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wrote about in the book, and this is actually true of most state hospitals around the country. They were huge concerns, and they had their own, many of them had their own, you know, their own farm. I think there was a dairy, and, you know.
There's a huge garden also.
Yeah, and they had their own fire department. I mean, it was like a little town.
Right.
And so, yeah, it just that, you know, the only thing I can say about the farm that relates to the patients is some of the ones who could help at the farm did it, and it was considered occupational therapy, and also you could interpret it as that free labor. But I do remember reading about another state hospital where there was this guy that was really a very valuable and patient employee, and he really could have been sent home, but they were like, they needed him. So they didn't release him, and I think that kind of thing also happened too. But, yeah.
We have time for one more, Julian?
Yeah, one more. Anybody else? Okay, did you have one more thing?
Just one other thing. There was a huge volunteer force also from Preston and the surrounding communities. Sheila Barry was a director of volunteers. Some of you may remember her. She passed away 2 years ago. But she was amazing because she pulled together the auxiliary. And it's interesting because the auxiliary was made up of basically folks that had daughters, sons, husbands, wives in Norwich Hospital. And one of the functions of the auxiliary before I got there and became the evil person was that they always had these elaborate luncheons. And I said, we're not going to do this any longer.
Would you mean for the auxiliary, not the patients?
For the auxiliary.
Yeah.
And so I decided, no, guess what? We're not doing that any longer. We'll have coffee and tea and cookies.
Right.
And that's how we ended up. But then the auxiliary moved to one of the members' houses down in Groton, Long Point, where partying continued.
Okay, well, party will go on. And so, speaking of, let's get the book part done.
Thank you so much, Julianne. And if anybody should have any follow-up questions, how's the best way for them to get in touch with you? Or
Oh, okay, so I have a website, it's my name, JulianneMandrew.com. And there's a contact form, and, you know, I love getting email from people. I especially really enjoy Facebook, and they have, you know, I would like to know what people thought of it, if they had any further questions. I'm sure someone will point out a mistake, and I'm good at that too. But yeah, so yes, JulianneMandrew.com.
thank you, Julianne.